Oklahoma, 1944. When the cattle cars rolled to a stop at Camp Alva, the German prisoners inside expected barbed wire and brutality. Among them was Matthias Vogel, 39, a carpenter from Cologne, whose weathered hands still remembered the feel of oak and pine. As he stepped onto American soil, the prairie wind carried something he hadn't felt in years, hope, though he didn't dare name it yet. The guards spoke firmly but without hatred, and when one noticed Matthias examining the wooden fence posts with a craftsman's eye, he simply nodded and said, "You know wood. Before we continue, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Here we retell the human stories forgotten by war." The camp stretched across the Oklahoma plains like a small town, with neat rows of barracks under an endless sky. Matthias had expected concrete cells and iron bars. Instead, he found wooden buildings that reminded him of the workshop he'd left behind in Cologne. The mess hall smelled of coffee and cornbread, not gruel and desperation. When Captain Robert Hayes addressed the new arrivals, his voice carried authority, but not cruelty. "You are prisoners of war," Hayes announced in careful German, "but you are also men. Work honestly, cause no trouble, and you'll find this place more fair than you might expect." That first night, lying on a real mattress with clean sheets, Matthias stared at the ceiling and wondered if this was some elaborate form of psychological warfare. In the distance, he could hear American soldiers laughing around a radio, the sound so normal it seemed impossible. Through the window, the Oklahoma stars shone with the same light that had blessed his home in Germany before the war changed everything. The next morning brought the shock of routine kindness. Hot coffee with breakfast, guards who said good morning instead of barking orders. When Matthias was assigned to the carpentry detail, repairing camp furniture, he almost wept at the familiar weight of a hammer in his hand. The American sergeant, Bill Murphy, watched him work for a few minutes, then handed him better tools. "These'll serve you better," Murphy said in broken German. "My grandfather was a carpenter too." As weeks passed, Matthias discovered something remarkable. Respect flowed both ways in this strange prison. When he finished a difficult repair ahead of schedule, the guards thanked him. When a young American soldier struggled to fix a wobbly table, Matthias showed him the proper technique, and the soldier listened like a student, not a conqueror. The camp had its rules and boundaries, but within them, humanity bloomed in unexpected ways. Matthias began to understand that the Americans saw him not as a monster to be caged, but as a man who happened to be on the wrong side of a terrible war. And slowly, carefully, he began to see them the same way. One evening, as he sat carving a small wooden cross from a scrap of pine, Matthias realized he was praying for the first time since Stalingrad. Not just for his own survival, but for his captors' safety, for an end to the madness, for a world where carpenters could build instead of destroy. The prayer felt dangerous and wonderful, like the first green shoots after a hard winter. 3 months into his captivity, Matthias had settled into a rhythm that felt almost like living. He woke before dawn, worked in the carpentry shop until evening, and spent quiet hours reading books from the camp library. American books, German books, even some in English he was slowly learning to understand. The guards had stopped watching him so closely, and some of the younger soldiers would stop by the workshop just to watch him work, fascinated by his precise craftsmanship. It was on a particularly cold November morning when Matthias made the request that would transform not just his own life, but the entire camp. He had been thinking about it for weeks, weighing the words, wondering if he dared ask such a thing. Finally, he approached Captain Hayes during the morning inspection. "Sir," Matthias said in his careful English, "I have question." Hayes paused, his clipboard balanced against his hip. In 3 months, the captain had come to respect the quiet German carpenter who worked without complaint and treated everyone with dignity. "What is it, Vogel?" "The men. We have no place for God." Matthias struggled with the English words, then continued in German. Hoping the captain would understand, he gestured toward his heart, then upward, trying to convey what he meant. "Church, we need place to pray." Hayes studied him for a long moment. The request wasn't entirely unprecedented. He'd heard of other camps allowing religious services, but it was still unusual. And there was something in Matthias's weathered face, a quiet desperation mixed with hope, that struck him. "You want to build a church?" Hayes said slowly. "Yes, sir, small. I can build. Other men help. We have wood scraps from repairs. Yes? I make good church. Beautiful church." That evening, Hayes discussed the request with his staff. Some officers worried about giving the prisoners too much freedom, while others argued that religious activity might actually improve morale and reduce escape attempts. After much debate, Hayes made his decision. The next morning, he found Matthias in the workshop, carefully sanding a cabinet door. "Vogel," he said, and waited for the German to look up. "Your church. You can build it." For a moment, Matthias didn't understand. Then the words sank in, and his face transformed with such pure joy that Hayes felt something loosen in his own chest. "Truly," Matthias whispered. "Truly. But there are conditions. You build it yourself, with volunteer help from other prisoners. You use only scrap materials and donated supplies, and both German and American services will be welcome there." Matthias nodded so vigorously that Hayes almost smiled. "Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. God bless you, sir." Word spread through the camp like wildfire. Some prisoners were skeptical. Surely this was too good to be true. But others, men who had been carrying their faith like a hidden ember through the darkness of war, began to feel that ember grow into a flame. Now, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time of day this story found you. It's curious to know how far these human memories can travel. That evening, Matthias walked the perimeter of the camp, looking for the perfect spot. Near the western fence, where the prairie stretched toward the sunset, he found a small clearing protected by a grove of cottonwood trees. It felt sacred already, this quiet place where the Oklahoma wind whispered through the branches like ancient prayers. He knelt in the grass, his hands pressed against the earth, and prayed with tears streaming down his face. Not tears of sorrow, but of overwhelming gratitude. In a prison camp thousands of miles from home, surrounded by enemies who had become friends, he was going to build a house of God. The American guards watched from a distance, many of them moved by the sight of the middle-aged German carpenter weeping with joy in an empty field. They had witnessed something remarkable, the moment when captivity became freedom, when enemy became brother, when war gave way to worship. The construction began on a crisp December morning, with Matthias and 12 volunteer prisoners gathered around the chosen site. Captain Hayes had provided them with salvaged lumber from camp maintenance projects, and the quartermaster had quietly supplemented their supplies with nails, hinges, and even some decent timber when no one was looking. The American soldiers watched the project with growing fascination, and more than a few found excuses to walk by the construction site throughout the day. Matthias approached the building like a master craftsman, which he was. He sketched the plans in the dirt with a stick, showing the other men how they would create something beautiful from scraps and prayers. The design was simple but elegant, a rectangular sanctuary with a peaked roof, large windows to let in the prairie light, and a small bell tower that would rise toward the Oklahoma sky like an offering. "We build not just with wood," Matthias told his helpers in German, "but with hope. Every nail we drive, every board we place, we do it with love. This church will stand as proof that God's house has no borders." Klaus Weber, a former baker from Munich, worked alongside Ernst Richter, who had been a music teacher before the war. Hans Brenner, barely 19 and homesick beyond words, found comfort in the rhythm of construction work. These men, who had been soldiers and prisoners, slowly transformed into something more, builders of a sanctuary that would serve both sides of a bitter conflict. The American guards initially maintained their distance, but curiosity soon overcame protocol. Sergeant Murphy, the one whose grandfather had been a carpenter, began offering suggestions about the foundation. "You'll want to dig those post holes deeper," he told Matthias through gestures and broken German. Oklahoma clay shifts with the weather. By the third day, something extraordinary was happening. Young American soldiers were volunteering their off-duty time to help with the construction. Private Tommy Chen, whose family had been interned in California simply for being Japanese-American, understood something about faith-sustaining people in impossible circumstances. He worked silently alongside the German prisoners, passing tools and holding boards steady while Matthias worked his careful magic. The project became a bridge between two worlds. When the prisoners struggled to communicate a building technique, the American soldiers helped translate. When supplies ran short, donations appeared from unexpected sources. The camp cook contributed leftover lumber from crate deliveries. Local farmers, hearing about the project through the guards, began dropping off materials at the camp gates. The most remarkable moment came when Matthias was struggling to install the main beam for the roof. It was heavy work that required perfect timing and multiple hands. Captain Hayes, who had been watching from his office window, finally walked over to the construction site. "You need more men for this," he said simply. Within minutes, 6 American soldiers were working alongside the German prisoners to raise the beam. As they lifted together, grunting with effort, the distinctions between captor and captive seemed to evaporate. They were just men building something beautiful, something that mattered. As the walls rose, so did something intangible but profound, a sense of community that transcended nationality and ideology. The church became a symbol of what was possible when people saw each other's humanity rather than each other's uniforms. Evenings found Matthias alone at the construction site, running his hands over the day's work, checking joints and measuring angles. The structure was taking shape beautifully, its clean lines and sturdy construction, a testament to German craftsmanship and American generosity. But more than that, it was becoming a place where the divine could dwell, regardless of the language of the prayers offered within its walls. Local townspeople began driving out to see the church that German prisoners were building with American help. Some came expecting to disapprove, but most left quietly moved by what they witnessed. Enemy soldiers creating something sacred with their captors' blessing and assistance. The site challenged assumptions about the nature of both war and worship. By Christmas week, the basic structure was complete. The walls stood strong, the roof was tight against the weather, and the windows framed views of the endless Oklahoma prairie. All that remained was the interior work and the small details that would transform a building into a sanctuary. Standing in the doorway at sunset, Matthias felt a peace he hadn't known since before the war began. Tomorrow, they would begin work on the altar, the pews, and the simple cross that would crown their achievement. But tonight, as the western sky blazed with winter light, he simply stood in his half-finished church and gave thanks for the miracle of human kindness in a world gone mad with conflict. By mid-January 1945, the little church stood complete, its modest steeple pointing toward the Oklahoma sky like a finger raised in benediction. Matthias had crafted every detail with loving precision: simple wooden pews that could seat 50 people, an altar carved from a single piece of donated oak, windows that caught the morning light and threw it across the sanctuary in golden streams. Above the altar hung a wooden cross, its proportions perfect, its surface smooth as silk under Matthias's patient hands. The question now was, who would conduct the first service? The German prisoners included men from various Protestant denominations and a few Catholics, while the American staff represented an even broader spectrum of faiths. Captain Hayes had contacted military chaplains from nearby bases, but none were immediately available. It seemed the little church might sit empty while bureaucracy determined its worthiness. The solution came from an unexpected source. Father Michael O'Brien, an elderly Irish-American priest from the town of Alva, had been visiting the camp occasionally to provide spiritual counsel to Catholic soldiers. When he learned about the church project, he requested permission to conduct an ecumenical service that would welcome everyone, regardless of denomination or nationality. "Faith has no uniform," Father O'Brien told Captain Hayes, "and God speaks all languages." The service was scheduled for Sunday morning, January 21st. As word spread through the camp, excitement mixed with nervous uncertainty. Would German prisoners and American soldiers actually worship together? Could men who had recently been trying to kill each other kneel side by side in prayer? Matthias spent Saturday evening in the church making final preparations. He had carved small wooden hymn books with both German and English lyrics and arranged wildflowers in mason jars donated by the camp kitchen. The building smelled of fresh wood and possibility. Sunday morning dawned clear and cold, as the church bell, a gift from the town of Alva, rang across the camp for the first time. People began gathering. The German prisoners came first, many carrying Bibles they had been allowed to keep. They filled the pews on the left side of the sanctuary, their faces showing a mixture of joy and disbelief. Then the American soldiers began arriving. Some came out of curiosity, others from genuine faith, but all seemed to understand they were witnessing something historic. They took seats on the right side of the church, leaving a careful space between themselves and the prisoners. Captain Hayes entered with his wife, who had driven out from town specially for the occasion. Several townspeople followed, farmers and shopkeepers who had contributed materials or simply wanted to see what their donations had built. The little church filled with a congregation unlike any in American history. Father O'Brien stood at the altar, his white hair gleaming in the morning light streaming through the windows. He began with a prayer in English, then repeated key phrases in his halting German. His message was simple but profound. God's love recognized no boundaries, and this sacred space belonged to all who entered with sincere hearts. The first hymn was Amazing Grace, chosen because many Germans knew it as O Gnade Gottes, Quelle alles Guten. As voices began to rise, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence, something magical happened. The careful segregation between left and right sides of the sanctuary began to dissolve. American soldiers found themselves harmonizing with German prisoners. Matthias's beautiful acoustics carried their combined voices toward the rafters he had so carefully crafted. During the sermon, Father O'Brien spoke about the parable of the Good Samaritan, emphasizing how people who were supposed to be enemies could show each other unexpected kindness. He gestured toward the church itself, built by enemy hands with friendly help, as proof that such stories continued to unfold in the modern world. The most powerful moment came during communion. Father O'Brien had arranged for both Protestant and Catholic elements to be available, and he invited anyone who wished to participate. The first person to rise was Matthias, who walked slowly toward the altar with tears streaming down his face. Behind him came Klaus, Ernst, and Hans. Then, after a moment's hesitation, Sergeant Murphy stood and joined the line. One by one, prisoners and guards, soldiers and civilians, Germans and Americans, knelt together at the altar rail. They received bread and wine, blessing and forgiveness from the same hands and the same source. In that moment, the church Matthias had built with scrap lumber and donated nails became what he had always envisioned, a place where God's love made all people family. As the service concluded with the doxology sung in 2 languages simultaneously, there wasn't a dry eye in the sanctuary. Captain Hayes, who hadn't been to church since childhood, found himself deeply moved. Several German prisoners embraced American soldiers they had worked beside during construction. Townspeople shook hands with enemy prisoners, seeing them now as neighbors in faith rather than threats to security. If this story has moved you, please like this video. It helps Matthias's story reach more people and reminds us of what war tried to erase. our shared humanity. Walking back to the barracks after the service, Matthias felt a completeness he hadn't experienced since before the war began. He had built more than a church. He had helped construct a bridge between hearts that ideology had tried to separate. In that little sanctuary on the Oklahoma prairie, Germans and Americans had discovered something the politicians and generals seemed to have forgotten. They were all children of the same God, all worthy of the same love, all capable of the same grace. The church would continue to host services throughout the remainder of the war, becoming a symbol of reconciliation that influenced both prisoners and guards long after they returned to their respective homes. But this first service, this breakthrough moment when enemies became family around a simple wooden altar, would be remembered by everyone present as the day faith conquered fear. As 1945 progressed and news of Germany's surrender reached Camp Alva, the little church became more than a place of worship. It became a symbol of what was possible when people chose understanding over hatred. The regular Sunday services had grown into midweek Bible studies, interfaith discussions, and even joint musical performances that drew visitors from across Oklahoma. The church that Matthias built had become famous far beyond the camp's boundaries. The transformation wasn't limited to religious activities. The spirit of cooperation that had built the church spread throughout the camp. German prisoners and American guards began collaborating on other projects. A library, a workshop for teaching trades, even a small garden where vegetables grew to supplement camp meals. The atmosphere of mutual respect that Father O'Brien had blessed in that first service had taken root and flourished. For Matthias, the months following the church's completion were the most meaningful of his captivity. He found himself serving as an unofficial mediator between prisoners and guards, translating not just languages but cultures and perspectives. Young American soldiers sought his advice on carpentry projects, while homesick German prisoners found comfort in his steady presence and unwavering faith. The most significant development came in late spring, when Captain Hayes received orders to establish a reintegration program for German prisoners who would eventually return home. The goal was to help them readjust to civilian life while fostering democratic ideals. Hayes asked Matthias to help design the program, recognizing that the carpenter had become a bridge between two worlds. "You've shown us something important here," Hayes told him one evening, as they sat in the church watching the sunset through the handcrafted windows. "You've proven that former enemies can work together if they focus on what unites them rather than what divides them." Matthias nodded, his weathered hands tracing the smooth wood of the pew he had built with such care. "The church taught us this, Captain. When men pray together, they cannot hate together." As summer arrived, preparations began for the eventual repatriation of the German prisoners. The process would be gradual, with men returning to Germany in groups over several months. For many, including Matthias, the prospect of leaving brought mixed emotions. They were eager to return home to families and former lives, but they had also found something precious in this unlikely place, proof that humanity could triumph over hostility. The church services during those final months took on a bittersweet quality. Father O'Brien, now in his 70s but energized by his role in this historic reconciliation, spoke frequently about the responsibility of memory. "You have witnessed something extraordinary here," he told the mixed congregation. "Don't let the world forget that former enemies can become friends when they meet in the presence of God." Local newspapers began covering the story of the church at Camp Alva. Reporters came to interview Matthias, Captain Hayes, and the soldiers who had worked together on the construction. The stories spread across the country, offering hope to a war-weary nation that peace might indeed be possible. Some accounts described the church as a miracle of wartime cooperation, while others saw it as proof of the power of faith to heal even the deepest divisions. In September 1945, Matthias received word that he would be among the first group to return to Germany. The news brought tears of joy, mixed with genuine sorrow at leaving behind the community he had helped create. On his final Sunday at the church, the congregation held a special farewell service that drew the largest crowd in the building's history. Father O'Brien asked Matthias to speak, and the carpenter stood slowly at the altar he had crafted with his own hands. His English had improved dramatically during his captivity, and his words carried the weight of profound experience. "This church," he said, gesturing around the sanctuary, "is built from broken wood made beautiful again. Like us, we came here as enemies, broken by war, but God's love, American kindness, and shared work made us beautiful again. When I go home to Germany, I take this lesson. Hate divides, but love builds." There wasn't a dry eye in the sanctuary as Matthias concluded his remarks. The congregation sang "Amazing Grace" one final time, their voices carrying across the Oklahoma prairie like a prayer made audible. After the service, dozens of people, German and American, prisoner and guard, civilian and soldier, embraced the carpenter who had shown them all what faith in action could accomplish. The next morning, as Matthias boarded the bus that would begin his journey home, he carried with him a small wooden cross carved from leftover timber from the church construction. Captain Hayes had given him an official letter describing his exemplary conduct and his role in the church project. Several American soldiers had written personal notes wishing him well in his post-war life. But Matthias's most precious possession was a photograph of the congregation gathered in front of the church after that first historic service. Germans and Americans stood together, their faces showing the joy of people who had discovered something precious, the possibility of peace between former enemies. Years later, Matthias would establish a carpentry workshop in rebuilt Cologne, where he taught young men not just woodworking skills, but also the lessons he had learned in Oklahoma. He kept the photograph on his workshop wall, telling the story to anyone who would listen, how enemies became friends when they built something beautiful together, how faith could bridge any divide, how a simple church in the American prairie had proved that love was stronger than war. Subscribe to our channel, hit the like button, and tell us in the comments which part of this story touched you most. Because sometimes peace begins when we retell the past with empathy, remembering not just the battles fought, but the bridges built by people who chose hope over hatred. The little church at Camp Alva continued to serve the local community long after the prisoners returned home. Its handcrafted beauty, a permanent reminder that even in humanity's darkest hours, faith and friendship could create something sacred from the ruins of conflict. Cologne, Germany, 1962. 17 years after the war's end, Matthias Vogel stood in his carpentry workshop on Ehrenstrasse, watching his apprentice Johannes carefully measure a piece of oak. The young man's concentration reminded Matthias of himself at that age, before the world had taught him that enemies could become friends and that churches could be built from scraps and hope. "Meister Vogel," Johannes said, looking up from his work, "why do you always check the grain twice before cutting?" Matthias smiled, his weathered hands still steady despite his 57 years. "Because wood has a story, Johannes. Respect the story, and the wood will serve you well." He paused, glancing at the faded photograph on his workshop wall. Dozens of faces, German and American, gathered in front of a small wooden church under an Oklahoma sky. Everything we build carries the story of how it was made. The workshop had become something of a pilgrimage site for those who had heard the story of Camp Alva. Former prisoners who had settled across Germany would make the journey to Cologne to visit the man who had built the church that changed everything. American tourists, guided by stories their fathers or grandfathers had told, would sometimes appear at his door, eager to meet the German carpenter who had shown them that peace was possible. Captain Robert Hayes had visited twice, once in 1955 and again in 1960, each time bringing photographs and updates from the camp that had been converted into a state park. The church still stood, maintained by the Oklahoma Historical Society and used for weddings, community gatherings, and an annual interfaith service every January 21st, the anniversary of that first remarkable Sunday service. "The building is exactly as you left it," Hayes had told him during his last visit. "But what you really built there, that travels. I've seen it in how my soldiers treat German immigrants in their hometowns, how they talk to their children about the war. You taught us something about seeing people instead of uniforms." Father O'Brien had passed away in 1958, but not before establishing a scholarship fund for young people from different countries to study together in America. The Alva Church Fellowship had already brought together students from Germany, Japan, Italy, and the United States, continuing the priest's belief that understanding grew from shared experiences rather than shared languages. Klaus Weber, the former baker who had helped build the church, had opened a small cafe in Munich where he served both German pastries and American-style coffee. Ernst Richter taught music in Hamburg, leading a choir that specialized in hymns from different cultures. Hans Brenner, the homesick teenager who had found comfort in construction work, became an architect dedicated to designing community centers that brought diverse populations together. Sergeant Murphy had returned to his family's construction business in Ohio, where he employed several German immigrants and always credited his time at Camp Alva with teaching him the difference between building and creating. Private Tommy Chen had become a social worker in California, helping other families navigate the challenges of cultural integration. But perhaps the most profound legacy lived in the stories themselves. Matthias received letters regularly from children and grandchildren of both American guards and German prisoners, people who had grown up hearing about the church where enemies prayed together. Some wrote to say they had become teachers, working to help young people understand different cultures. Others had joined the diplomatic corps or international aid organizations, carrying forward the lesson that cooperation was possible even between former adversaries. The workshop's afternoon light caught the grain of the oak Johannes was preparing, and Matthias saw in it the same potential he had recognized in those Oklahoma lumber scraps so many years ago. "What are you making, boy?" he asked. "A jewelry box for my sister's wedding," Johannes replied. "She's marrying an American soldier stationed in Frankfurt. She says I should make it sturdy enough to travel between countries." Matthias laughed, the sound rich with memory and satisfaction. "Then we'll make it from the best wood we have. Love that crosses borders deserves the finest craftsmanship." As evening approached and Johannes cleaned up his workspace, Matthias remained alone with the photograph and his memories. The little church in Oklahoma had proven that faith could indeed build bridges across any divide. But more than that, it had shown that ordinary people, carpenters and soldiers, bakers and farmers, priests and prisoners, could choose cooperation over conflict when they focused on their shared humanity rather than their historical differences. Outside his workshop window, Cologne's cathedral bells chimed the hour, their ancient song mixing with the sounds of reconstruction that still echoed through the city 17 years after the war's end. Germany was rebuilding, America was prospering, and somewhere in Oklahoma, a small wooden church continued to stand as proof that former enemies could create something beautiful together. Matthias touched the wooden cross hanging around his neck, carved from the same timber that had built the sanctuary where German prisoners and American guards first discovered they could be friends. Tomorrow, he would begin teaching Johannes about joinery techniques, passing on not just the skills of carpentry, but the deeper lesson he had learned under that vast Oklahoma sky. That building something together was the surest path to building peace. The church at Camp Alva had been more than architecture. It had been hope made visible, faith made tangible, and love made manifest in wood and nails and shared labor. And in workshops and classrooms, churches and community centers, families and friendships around the world, that legacy continued to grow, one conversation, one connection, one act of understanding at a time. The carpenter who had once been a prisoner had become a bridge builder, proving that the most important construction projects weren't built with lumber and nails, but with open hearts and willing hands extended across the divisions that war had tried to make permanent.